Ay, Dios mío de mi vida.
Twice in 4 days, the ground has opened up under one of the most visited monuments in Europe, and both times the epicenter sat almost exactly at the surface. A fortress complex nearly 1,000 years old had to be evacuated in the middle of a Tuesday morning. Here is what is actually happening underneath Granada, Spain, and why it matters far beyond Andalusia. The most recent earthquake struck at 10:37 in the morning on Tuesday, August 18th, with a magnitude of 4.7 to 4.8 at an epicenter near Gójar, pronounced Gójar, a town beside Alhendín, pronounced Alhendín, just south of Granada City. Spain's National Geographic Institute, the country's equivalent to the U.S. Geological Survey, put the depth at essentially ground level. 3 people were injured, one of them a child, taken to the hospital.
Yo estoy temblando, tío.
The Alhambra's Nasrid palaces and Alcazaba, pronounced Al-Kathaba, fortress were evacuated as a precaution, and Granada's metro slowed its trains to about 19 miles an hour, 30 kilometers an hour for safety. Several aftershocks followed within the hour, one reaching magnitude 4.2. This came 3 days after a stronger quake, magnitude 5.2, struck at 1 in the morning on August 15th near Alhendín, about 1.2 miles down, roughly 2 kilometers. That event triggered 98 aftershocks, damaged 5 historic churches badly enough to close them for inspection, and prompted Andalusia's regional government to activate the first operational phase of its seismic emergency plan. No deaths have been reported in either event. Seismologists have not determined whether this sequence is winding down or building towards something larger, and it may be weeks before that becomes clear. What is well understood is the mechanism producing these tremors in the first place, and that part does not depend on any investigation. So why does a fault this deep in southern Europe keep shaking the same city? The answer comes down to 3 things stacked on top of each other. The first is the collision itself. Southern Spain sits where the African plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate at a pace of roughly 4 to 5 millimeters a year. That sounds trivial, but picture 2 vehicles pressed bumper to bumper in a collision that lasts centuries instead of a second. The crumpling never happens in one clean spot. It happens wherever the rock is weakest, and southern Spain's crust is laced with smaller faults, absorbing that pressure piece by piece. The second is depth. Both of this week's earthquakes originated within a mile or 2 of the surface, which is shallow by any standard. A shallow quake puts all of its energy close to where people actually live, the same way a speaker sitting against the wall sounds louder than the same speaker playing from across the room. Spain has had far larger earthquakes than this one and barely felt them. A magnitude 7.8 in 1954 and a magnitude 6.3 in 2010, both more than 370 miles down, over 600 kilometers, both causing only minor damage because the energy had that much rock to pass through first. The third is the ground Granada itself sits on. The city occupies a mountain-ringed basin filled with soft sediment, and seismic waves entering that basin behave the way sound behaves in a tiled bathroom instead of an open field. They bounce off the harder rock at the basin's edges and get trapped, which stretches out the shaping and can make a moderate quake feel and behave like a stronger one by the time it reaches the surface. That still leaves the question that mattered most this week. Why did centuries-old churches crack while newer apartment blocks a few streets over reported almost nothing? Granada's historic core, including the 5 churches now closed for inspection, was built between the 16th and 18th centuries, long before anyone designed for earthquakes. The Alhambra itself dates back roughly 1,000 years, built stone by stone under the Nasrid dynasty on a hilltop above that same basin. Neither was engineered with seismic movement in mind, because nobody building them had a way to plan for it. But the detail investigators keep coming back to is smaller than the buildings themselves. It is the tallest, most ornamented parts that fail first: bell towers, stone cornices, decorative facades, and unbraced masonry gables sitting loosely on top of older walls. Those pieces have the most weight, moving the farthest from the building's center of gravity, so they are the first things to crack or come loose, while the plain, reinforced structure underneath often survives untouched. If you live near any building constructed before your area adopted modern seismic codes, an old brick chimney, an ornamental cornice, an unbraced parapet, that same vulnerable point exists over your head right now, whether or not you live anywhere near a fault line most people have heard of. No warning system stopped either earthquake from happening because there currently is no reliable way to predict a specific quake in advance anywhere in the world. What the seismic network did do was detect and locate both events within seconds and put a magnitude on them almost immediately, which is a different thing from prediction and is often mistaken for it. One assumption worth correcting directly: a swarm of aftershocks does not reliably signal that a bigger earthquake is coming. Most sequences like this one release stress in a series of smaller steps and never produce a larger main shock, though seismologists cannot rule it out from the pattern alone. What actually worked was preparation that existed before Tuesday. The Alhambra's evacuation protocol moved staff and visitors out within minutes because the plan already existed on paper, rather than being written on the fly. Andalusia's regional seismic risk plan let officials shift straight into an active emergency phase after Saturday's quake, rather than improvising a response from nothing, which is part of why the response to Tuesday's aftershock was faster still. Structural inspectors were already positioned to move quickly, which is why 5 churches were closed for assessment within hours, rather than days, and why the Alhambra's evacuation happened before, not after, anything actually came loose.
Residents in Alhendín described being thrown out of sleep before dawn on Saturday, with picture frames and dishes falling off shelves in the dark before anyone understood what was happening. On Tuesday, the same fear played out in daylight instead. Visitors inside the Alhambra's Nasrid palaces felt the floor move under them and were guided out through the fortress gates by staff, following an evacuation plan that already existed on paper well before this week. Emergency services in Granada fielded roughly 50 calls within the first hour, most reporting falling debris and cracked interior walls, along with a fallen tree that crushed a parked car on one of the city's main avenues. 3 people were hurt in Tuesday's quake, one seriously enough to be hospitalized, adding to a smaller number of minor injuries reported after Saturday's stronger tremor. No fatalities have been reported from either earthquake as of this reporting. Is Granada becoming more earthquake-prone, or does this just feel unusual because it is happening now? Spain's National Geographic Institute has answered a version of this question before. Between December of 2020 and February of 2021, the agency logged roughly 1,167 earthquakes in this same basin, near the towns of Atarfe and Santa Fe, 27 of them above magnitude 3 and the strongest reaching magnitude 4.4. This is not a region having its first bad week. It is a region that produces sequences like this one fairly regularly. What has changed is not the geology. Africa is still converging on Europe at essentially the same few millimeters a year it always has. What is different is the density of seismic monitoring, which now catches far smaller tremors than a network from a generation ago would have, and the fact that a felt earthquake now reaches people's phones within minutes instead of showing up in the next day's newspaper. What the data cannot tell us is whether this specific sequence is finished, building towards something larger, or simply another cycle in a pattern that has repeated here for centuries. Nobody studying this fault system claims to know that yet, and any claim otherwise is guesswork dressed up as certainty. None of this is unique to southern Spain. The same recipe, a fault system close to the surface running underneath a place full of older masonry, exists in parts of the United States most people do not think of as earthquake country at all. Salt Lake City, Utah, sits directly on the Wasatch Fault, where state geologists put the odds of a magnitude 6.75 or larger earthquake at roughly 43% over the next 50 years, with close to 140,000 unreinforced brick buildings still standing along that corridor. Memphis, Tennessee, and St. Louis, Missouri sit over the new Madrid Seismic Zone, another shallow fault system, where the U.S. Geological Survey puts the odds of a magnitude 6 or larger quake at 25 to 40% in that same 50-year window. And Charleston, South Carolina, a city almost nobody associates with earthquakes, sits on an active fault that produced a major shallow quake in 1886 and still carries a historic downtown built largely from unreinforced masonry. If you live somewhere with older brick or stone construction that predates your area's modern building code, whatever your local geology textbook calls the ground underneath you, you are looking at the same vulnerability Granada's churches just showed the entire world. You cannot stop a fault from slipping. You can control 4 things, and they are worth doing in this order. Start with your water heater. An unstrapped tank can tip over during shaking and tear the gas line loose on its way down, turning a trimmer into a fire. Metal strapping to wall studs is roughly a 30-minute job with a hardware store kit, and it is the single most cost-effective fix most homeowners can make. Second, keep closed-toe shoes and a flashlight under every bed. Most earthquake injuries after the shaking stops come from stepping on broken glass in the dark. That's a 10-minute setup once for the whole household. Third, know exactly where your home's gas shutoff valve is and keep a wrench near it, not in a drawer across the house. A few minutes now is what prevents a cracked line from becoming a fire hours after the ground stops moving. And fourth, the one almost nobody checks, a standard homeowner's or renter's policy in the United States does not cover earthquake damage. It has to be purchased separately, often through a state-run program. That's a 15-minute phone call to your agent, and it's the difference between a crack in the wall and a total loss with nothing behind it. Ready.gov and your state's emergency management agency publish earthquake checklists specific to where you live, including the closest fault system to your address. As of the latest reports, Spain's seismic network is still logging smaller aftershocks around Alhendín and Gójar. The Alhambra's Nasrid palaces remain closed pending inspection, and the 5 damaged churches are still shut. The lesson investigators keep repeating is not about the size of the earthquake, it's about depth and what happens to sit directly on top of it. What is the oldest building near where you live, and has anyone ever actually checked what's holding its roof on?